Good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Jenna Ben-Yehuda. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Council. Thank you for joining us for today's hybrid event, The Future of U.S. Strategy Towards Iran, a bipartisan roadmap for the next administration. This report is noteworthy for at least three reasons: its bipartisan nature, its holistic approach, and its timing. The Atlantic Council has long prided itself on not just being a thought leader on U.S. foreign policy, but on its ability to provide actionable solutions with real-world impact. The report being launched today does just that in a manner not previously accomplished because it overcomes the partisan divide that has plagued and really undermined Washington's efforts on this issue for much of the last few decades. Years of partisan rancor has made the issue of Iran a third rail in many U.S. foreign policy discussions, which also led to significant skepticism over its potential for success when this strategy project first kicked off. And nothing motivates us here more at the Council than hearing that something can't be done. And so today's launch is proof of that. And I want to be clear that this effort is much more about than just disproving the skeptics, but that the lack of a bipartisan approach on Iran has also had a significant cost. The wild swings of U.S. foreign policy towards Iran over the last decade have created substantial policy gaps that Iran has exploited to more rapidly advance its regional malign influence and its nuclear program. But more than that, the absence of a sustained approach has undermined American credibility with our allies in the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. But it's not just about the approach being bipartisan, it also has to be the right approach, one that is holistic in nature and reflects the breadth and complexity of the challenges Iran poses. This report's comprehensive view, which extends beyond Iran's nuclear program to the devastating impacts of its regional malign influence and the imperative to broaden the multilateral pressure on Iran, offers a nuanced series of recommendations to the incoming administration that are actionable and durable. Which brings me to my third point, timing. With the events we see unfolding literally before our eyes today in the Middle East, this report is more critical than ever before. Yesterday, of course, marked 1 year since Hamas's October 7th terrorist attack of last year, an attack that would not have been possible without Iran's direct and sustained support. And over the past year, we've seen an unequivocal expansion of Iran's malign influence in the Middle East, from its support of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip to abetting the Houthi rebels in Yemen and its continued backing of Hezbollah in Lebanon and Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. Just last week, we witnessed another round of Iran's unprecedented aggression against Israel, a stark reminder that the Islamic Republic is not backtracking in its goals to exert pressure and dominance in the region. So the report's timing is critical because its relevance to Iran's role in this very moment is so poignant, but also because, as you might have heard, we have a small election coming up in just a few weeks. And as you'll hear throughout the course of today's discussions, the report provides practical recommendations to the incoming administration on not just how to curb Iran's regional influence and support of proxies, but also how to curb its nuclear program, keep its ballistic missiles program in check, better counter Iran's hostage-taking and assassination campaigns, support the aspirations and human rights of the Iranian people, and how to work with allies internationally and partners to contain Iran. In just a moment, I'll introduce and hand the floor to my terrific colleague, Jonathan Panikoff, the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative and the Iran Strategy Project. You'll have an opportunity to hear from him, the primary author of the report, and 3 key advisory committee members who helped to craft the report's dozens of recommendations. But first, let me offer them all my heartfelt congratulations for the success of this effort. It was far from easy or guaranteed. The Iran Strategy Project launched almost 2 years ago, bringing together U.S. foreign policy and Iran experts across the ideological spectrum. The advisory committee, working group, and other contributors include liberals, conservatives, centrists, military, human rights experts, experienced diplomats and intelligence community veterans, leading authorities on sanctions and natural resources, and so many others. But the dedication, time, and commitment by the dozens of people who contributed to this truly tremendous report in ways big and small enabled those partisan divides to be overcome and demonstrated for the first time that the development of a comprehensive, holistic, and bipartisan Iran strategy is indeed possible. So today is the culmination of 2 years of work, but it is not the end. In addition to the report's release and the excellent program we have planned for you today, the team will continue to offer briefings and engage on its recommendations for months to come. So now let me turn to Jonathan to introduce and moderate today's first panel, which will be followed by a conversation with NBC's Courtney Kube and former National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster. Jonathan, over to you.
Jenna, thank you so much for that tremendous introduction. It's been my absolute privilege to lead the Iran Strategy Project, and I could not be more thrilled to be with you all today to launch the report as well as moderate today's first session. Now, admittedly, when we started this effort, I also could not have imagined that we would be releasing the report at a time when the tensions in the region were at their highest point in years. But it frankly reinforces the criticality of the U.S. having a holistic and comprehensive strategy. And I'm incredibly proud that such a strategy exists in this report for the next administration, regardless of whether it's Vice President Harris or former President Trump who wins in November. To read the report, please visit our website, atlanticcouncil.org, or for those in the room, you can scan the QR code on the booklet you received. Now, this report was made possible only by the dozens who helped contribute to it. And I'm thrilled to have a few of the members of the ISP Advisory Committee and its primary author joining us today to talk about where the U.S. policy toward Iran should go. Right next to me on my left is Ambassador Paul Foley, a career diplomat who served as Australia's ambassador to Iran, Afghanistan, and Timor-Leste during his distinguished career, and before he concluded his service in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as ambassador for counterterrorism. Beth Sanner is the former Deputy Director of National Intelligence and a career CIA officer who served as a member of the Senior Intelligence Service. She's now Director for Geopolitics at International Capital Strategies, as well as a Senior Fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center and a CNN contributor. Alan Pino is the former U.S. National Intelligence Officer for the Near East on the National Intelligence Council, a role he held for 15 years. A career CIA analyst and group chief, he was the recipient of the Director's Award and the George H.W. Bush Award for Excellence in Counterterrorism, and he now serves as an adjunct lecturer at Texas A&M Bush School of Government in Washington, D.C., and was the primary author of the report. Finally, we're joined virtually by Sanam Vakil, the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House in London. Sanam is also the James Anderson Professorial Lecturer at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy. A widely recognized expert on Iran's domestic and foreign policy, as well as on Gulf politics. She's the author of the book, Action and Reaction, Women in Politics in Iran. Thank you all for joining us for what I know is going to be a tremendously exciting and lively conversation. And just before we begin, let me remind the audience that if you want to ask a question, you'll have an opportunity to do so later on, and you can reach out to us at askac.org to do so. Ambassador Foley, let me begin with you if I could, and let me quote from the report right up front. The report says, very explicitly, quote, dealing with Iran calls for bipartisan long-term strategy that can span administrations in which the U.S. works patiently and resolutely to counter Iranian efforts to drive the U.S. out of the Middle East. You're one of only two people who was part of the ISP Advisory Committee who served in an official government capacity in Iran. But you're also coming at this from a non-U.S. perspective. So walk us through, if you would, what might be the most basic question, but perhaps also the most critical to get right in formulating this report. why does the U.S. need a bipartisan, comprehensive, and long-term strategy toward Iran?
Oh, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to you and the Atlantic Council for the opportunity to participate in this project. As Jenna said, not only were there liberals, conservatives, and centrists involved in it, there were also foreigners. So it speaks to your openness. To answer your question, I think that the starting point has to be that the current approach, which has been noted, has been characterised by quite significant swings of approach between administrations, simply hasn't worked. The concerning elements of Iranian behaviour have all got worse over time. We've continued to see the use of proxies and the associated hollowing out of regional states, Iran's continued nuclear progress, and the continuing repression of the aspirations of the Iranian people. Now, these are all significant challenges. They're not capable of quick fixes, and as the strategy makes clear, they really do require a long-term approach. And I think a long-term approach, if it is to straddle US administrations, needs to be bipartisan in order to be effective. Added to that, of course, it's very important that a bipartisan approach is also a message to the Iranian regime that they can't just sit out a particular administration that they may be concerned about, or a policy approach they may be concerned about, that approach, with some differences in emphasis between administrations, will continue. And of course, it's allies like bipartisan approaches too. Well, I suppose allies tend to like predictability. And I think a bipartisan approach is more likely to get support from allies over time if they understand that the policy lines are going to persist, and it's also likely to result in less hedging behaviour by allies, particularly regional allies, of which we've seen a little, and that can reduce the effectiveness of an approach. So I think the simple answer is that what's happened to date hasn't delivered, and it's time to try something else.
Appreciate that. It's a great framing for this. So let's talk about some of the things that are that something else in this report. Beth, the report makes clear, and in fact it highlights possible incentives for Iranian engagement. It explicitly says the goal is to enter into new negotiations eventually. But there's also an unambiguous call to significantly increase pressure against Iran by the U.S., by allies, across Iran's nefarious behavior, whether the nuclear program, regional malign influence, hostage-taking, assassination campaigns, attempted election interference that we're seeing just today. There's going to be a number of folks here in the U.S. who are going to say, we shouldn't be trying to increase pressure. We should just go back into negotiations immediately. President Pezeshkian, the new Iranian president, wants them and has indicated an openness to them. Allies of the U.S., especially in the Middle East, are trying to tamp down tensions. We saw just this morning Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan announced he's going to host his Iranian counterpart, who's going to be beginning a tour of the region. But all those who worked on the report felt ultimately that as much as allies would like to tamp down tensions, there is a need to increase pressure first. Why? Why does pressure have to come before we just go to negotiations?
I think, there are a couple reasons. One is we just look at history, right? If we just look at how did the JCPOA go, and that's very clearly it worked in one element, in my view. It tamped down the nuclear program, and at the same time during this period we saw an explosion of Iran's missile program, and the whole idea of the proxies and the axis of resistance literally was born during this period. It grew and became the threat that led to what we're seeing right now. And so, it's just not possible, in my view, given the view of everyone around the table during these past 2 years. When you look at the Iranian regime, who's in charge? The supreme leader, who just gave a speech on Friday that made no bones about the idea that October 7th was the right thing to do, and that Iran was going to double down on its support of its proxies. And so, given that environment, you can have a group of people in Iran who might honestly want to be pursuing negotiations. But you also have the hardliners, and particularly the IRGC, who seem to be winning the arguments these days in terms of the willingness to confront Israel and the West. And so if you don't have pressure, I don't see how we would, in a negotiation, do anything except divide the West, divide the United States, and we would never get a comprehensive agreement. And that's really what this is about, right? It's not about JCPOA or another thing.
Beth, you just mentioned the development of the proxies and how they strengthened over the last decade plus, really. Alan, to that point, let me ask you, since October 7th, we've actually seen Iranian proxies launch over 150 attacks against U.S. forces in the Middle East. A key recommendation early in the report is that the U.S. should respond forcefully to every single attack that Iran or one of its proxies undertakes. And I should note the report highlights a majority of views that the response should be against the proxy that takes the attack, not against Iran itself. There's a minority that thinks, no, we should actually go after Iran directly for every attack. But either way, you would have a massive shift in, frankly, U.S. military posture and effort at a time when we know that the U.S. remains committed to calming tensions in the region, to Ukraine, to increasing concerns about Taiwan and where China is going to be. Why does the report take the position that responding to every attack is actually necessary? And how does doing so fit into the larger strategy laid out of the report for a holistic approach to Iran?
Well, first of all, the debate the discussion we had about how the U.S. should respond to proxy attacks was taking place in the post-October 7th environment. And what we were seeing there was repeated attacks against the U.S. presence in Iraq and Syria in particular, and also our ships in the Red Sea by Iran's proxies. The U.S. responded occasionally to the attacks that the Shia militias were conducting against our forces in Iraq and Syria, but they had little impact. They were having little impact on their willingness to continue. And we were suffering, our forces were suffering injuries. We ultimately had three soldiers killed. I think there was something like 170 or more attacks against our forces with only a handful of responses. So it was in that context, and also looking at the history of I think, a perception that Iran had conducted attacks against U.S. forces after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, with supporting Shia militia attacks on our forces there. Several hundred U.S. soldiers killed without a significant U.S. response, and that since that time we had seen very little direct response to provocations from Iran or its proxies. So the consensus that emerged was that if you're going to start reestablishing deterrence, you're going to have to respond every time, and at a minimum respond proportionally to what Iran's proxies are doing. Some of us, the minority, felt that the U.S. initiative against Iran, and that would involve considering disproportionate attacks when appropriate, and also considering Iranian targets and not just going against proxies, to hold Iran accountable. The broader context of our discussion was our proposal that in order for the U.S. to maintain the support of allies, to send the right signal to Iran and its proxies, we needed to maintain and be able to actually conduct an effective response. We needed to maintain a pretty robust presence in the region, roughly the size of forces we have there now, 40,000 or so, possibly even a larger number of naval vessels to conduct patrols and be able to respond. And secondly, that we needed to continue the good work that CENTCOM and our U.S. military has already done in helping to build a regional security architecture that brings about cooperation between the U.S. and the Gulf states, Jordan and Egypt, in being able to defend against Iran, attacks by Iran or the proxies, and ultimately to create the conditions for bringing Israel more openly into that security apparatus as a counterbalance to Iran.
I think what's interesting is that even as some folks looked for an opportunity to have maybe disproportionate attacks or to strike Iran directly, the baseline for attacks now, or for response, is now much higher than the U.S. has ever executed, at least under the last decade, frankly, regardless of administration. And we're saying this report's recommending that we respond to every attack to create that level of deterrence that we haven't had.
Right, and the debate was really overweighing establishing deterrence versus the risk of escalation. Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Sanam, thrilled to have you joining us from London. Let me bring you in. There's few people, frankly, that have as strong a sense of Iranian sentiment on the street as you do. And so I want to ask about the Iranian people directly, because the report says the U.S. and its allies should publicly eschew regime change through external military intervention, but goes on to say that the United States also needs to reconsider its willingness to step up support for the millions of Iranians who are seeking freedom to determine the social and political future of their country for themselves. There were frankly few issues involved with our Iran strategy project that generated as much debate as this one. There are some in the group who thought originally, frankly, there should be nothing that the U.S. does to support the Iranian people, not because there wasn't a sentiment of desire, but simply a view that any action by the U.S. would be viewed by the regime as trying to undermine it and fundamentally ricochet on the Iranian people and harm them, including physically. There were folks on the other end of the spectrum who said, no, we actually need to do much, much more to directly support the Iranian people. In the end, we agreed upon a middle ground, I think it's fair to say, but it's an incredibly tricky balance. So let me ask you to talk through this a little bit. How should the U.S. go forth in supporting the Iranian people so that it doesn't undermine them? But I think the more important broad question that really we're trying to get at is, why does permanent change in Iran, if it's going to be successful and lasting, have to come from inside the country? And why can't it come from external actors?
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be with you all, albeit in a hybrid capacity, and really important topic and very timely. First of all, I want to just approach this topic with a huge amount of humility. While I have studied Iran for quite some time, I wouldn't by any means consider myself a voice for 85 million people. And so I don't truly know what the panoply of Iranian voices out there really want. And I think that we hear a lot from people in the diaspora about their concerns or aspirations for regime change or change in the regime inside Iran. To take it back to your question, I think more forcefully, any sort of change that does come to Iran, I think certainly has to come from within and be indigenous. And here, of course, as you referred in your question, this topic certainly provoked a wide array of debate among those of you that consulted with you and Alan on this body of work. I think For the United States, this is tricky, obviously, because of the history going back to 1953 and Mossadegh, but I think it's also tricky because of the United States' own history in the Middle East, dating back to 2001 and 2003, and the long overhang and legacy of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the U.S.'s departure from those contexts as well. This is a difficult, I think, topic for people to tackle, and it certainly generates a lot of debate and discussion from all sides of the landscape. But Iran is a dynamic and diverse place, and certainly we have seen over 45 years a huge amount of activism and agency coming from within Iran. We have seen multiple rounds of protests, including, of course, the Women, Life, Freedom protests that were repressed, but all Iranian protests have been repressed. Protests are a facet and feature of Iranian life. While there isn't a sort of coordinated and mobilized active opposition in a traditional way that we study it and see it in a political domain, protests are still ongoing. There have been nurses' protests, teachers' protests. It speaks to, of course, the deep divisions within the Iranian state, across the Iranian landscape. And it's worthwhile noting that in this year alone, executions have been at an all-time high in Iran. And many of Iran's important and sort of fearless and tireless activists, like Narges and Mohammadi, Nasrin Sotoudeh, women who have been at the forefront of a cause championing greater rights for women, but greater human rights and political rights across the spectrum, remain greatly repressed inside Iran. I think for the United States, it's important that regime change and that sort of language doesn't, I think, get mixed up in the priorities of national security. And American policymakers have to acknowledge what they can accomplish and what they can't accomplish. There is a lot of talk about regime change with regards to the Islamic Republic, but policymakers, I think, are not being very honest in acknowledging that in 2024, the United States and I think much of Western Europe isn't going to be supporting a military orchestrated external regime change from abroad. If that is to come, it has to be indigenous. It has to come from within. And what the United States can do is to support the ambitions and the vision that Iranians can aspire to. And the United States, along with its partners abroad, should be calling out the Islamic Republic for human rights abuses that remain flagrant and ongoing, for a campaign of repression that remains flagrant and ongoing. But the regime change language and rhetoric that comes from different sides of the American political spectrum, but also comes from the diaspora abroad, doesn't provide an avenue or an outlet for the United States to prioritize its own national security interests. And that is a very honest, but I think perhaps more clear way to address this very sensitive, emotional, and challenging issue.
Sanam, thank you very much. And I'll point out that as you raised the issue of human rights abuses, we talk quite a bit in the report, frankly, about how to go after Iran for this, including seeking to work with allies to kick Iran off of UN institutions, for instance, that Iran violates their raison d'etre on a daily basis. Some novel opportunities to try to go after Iran in ways that we just haven't, frankly, done before. Beth, when we talk about the report as a whole, one of the underlying principles fundamentally as we started the work for it was that the separation between, or prioritization, I should say, of Iran's nuclear program as an issue over its regional malign influence is not something that we could do anymore. there are going to be quite a few people who say no. The nuclear issue is the existential one. The nuclear challenge is the one that we really have to address, and that should be the focus first, and maybe only, and then you can go on to look at everything else. Why was that not the direction we went? Why do we say that in this report, no, those issues have to be looked at together and in a holistic manner?
You know, if you look at what's going on right now in the region, and you see the fact that the proxies are being diminished, it would be really foolhardy, in my view, just to go after the nuclear program and ignore the moment we're in. So that's number one. Just like practically, that would be kind of bad policy. But you know, more importantly, I think, is that once you're in a negotiation about one thing, the other thing is going to rear its head, because the entire purpose and mission, we can't forget why, you know, what the Iran leadership is driving toward. And when you understand that, which is, you know, regional hegemony, influence, and ultimately the destruction of Israel and the removal of the United States from the region, then if you're just dealing with nuclear, you still have all the other levers that they're going to apply against their strategic objectives. So the nuclear is just one aspect of it right now. And so if you only deal with that and then you're in a negotiation, it's very hard to put pressure on them in order to deal with the second issue. And that's exactly what the Obama administration found out. They didn't go into JCPOA thinking this is the end. They went in thinking, we'll just start here and then we'll move on. And the situation just didn't work, because practically, you can't use the pressure levers when you're in the middle of a one-trick pony. It just doesn't work.
There's insufficient leverage afterwards. If you deal only with the nuclear issue, then when you complete that, there won't be enough leverage left to deal with the regional
And we've
islands.
seen that. And I think the other part of this that's related is that, you know, the idea of just simply a JCPOA 2.0 is just not where any nuclear expert is at right now. I think that there is just bipartisan, across the community agreement that Iran is in a different place in their nuclear program. And for that reason, we get back to this pressure campaign too. We can't just go simply into a negotiation and thinking like, oh, well, we can just redo this. It worked for a while, and it did, because they're in a different place now.
We talked quite a bit at the very beginning of the report, saying we're not going to relitigate as part of the Iran strategy project either JCPOA or the maximum pressure campaign. I was actually quite proud that we stuck to that. I think it was pretty important. Otherwise, I think we may never have gotten unstuck, frankly, had we gone down that road. So
Exactly.
It's been a positive.
I think that this is really important as part of this bipartisan issue that we've really talked about, and Paul was focusing on. You know, it risks turning into a Thanksgiving dinner every time, over and over again, where you're relitigating, you know, that Johnny took my bike. But, you know, the bike is long gone, okay? Johnny's grown up now, and it's time for us to kind of put all of these things behind us and say, what are we dealing with now? It's different, and it's really different given the situation in the region. So all the things we're talking about have added urgency for us to come at this in a bipartisan way and let the past go.
Let me just remind folks, if you want to ask a question, please send a note to @askac.org, and we'll be taking them very shortly. Paul, Beth just talked about pressure being so critical, both to address both of the key issues here. But let me ask, because in the report, I'm going to quote here again, it says, even while seeking to organize broad-based pressure on Iran, which might include downgrading diplomatic representation in response to specific malign policies of the regime, the United States should oppose calls to isolate Iran diplomatically by closing diplomatic missions in Tehran. Such an approach would be counterproductive. There's going to be some people who read this report and say, no, that's exactly what we should do. Isolate them to bits, make it so that they've got no diplomatic contact, completely undermine them, not just militarily or economically, but diplomatically as well. As somebody who lived in Iran and served in Iran, why is that not a good idea? What's the challenge that it poses to U.S. and allied national security if you completely try to isolate Iran that way? Is it even possible? And frankly, how can the U.S. and its allies find the right balance between engagement and deterrence?
I think the most effective strategy is likely to be one that uses all the elements of statecraft, both pressure in terms of sanctions and deterrence, and also engagement. The track record of pressure-only approaches over the last 20 years hasn't been great, and of course, the record of promoting change through engagement only is not great either. In terms of promoting diplomatic isolation by reducing the diplomatic footprint in Iran, I'd argue that's not in the interests of those who want change in Iran. A reduced footprint is likely to lead to a less nuanced understanding of developments on the ground and regime dynamics. If there's reduced access to diplomatic reporting, engagement, and analysis. Now, I don't want to overstate that. Diplomatic reporting and engagement is only one stream of information, but it's an important part of the mosaic. Again, not to overstate it, but having embassies on the ground does provide a means of injecting views and opinions to at least some in the regime that may not hear them otherwise, and it is a regime that does tend to live in its own information bubble. I think most importantly that any approach that promotes diplomatic isolation through reducing the diplomatic footprint in Tehran sends precisely the wrong message to the Iranian people. And the message it sends is that they're on their own, and I think that would be quite disheartening, particularly to the internationalist middle classes. Now, the fact that some in the regime would be quite happy with a smaller diplomatic footprint in Tehran leads me to think that perhaps that's not the way to go either. As a practical issue, I think many states are unlikely to agree to reduce their diplomatic footprint. Iran's engagement with the global south has been quite effective, and I think in particular regional allies are unlikely to do it as a result of the hedging strategy that they've undertaken to date. So what's the right approach? What's the right balance? As I said, I think it's a mixture of engagement and pressure that should be modulated depending on the situation. There will be times where diplomacy is required to either manage a crisis or hopefully manage an Iranian climb down on a particular issue, and that's just one arm of statecraft that we should keep in our quiver. I've always thought that talking to people is not a reward. Talking to people is a tool, and I don't see why anyone would move away from that.
It's interesting. I think your point about the global south and regional allies, I think, is actually quite important here, because would you say that we're frankly at a place now different than we were when JCPOA happened, frankly, that U.S. pressure to, say, try to isolate Iran so holistically is actually only going to cause increased tensions with Arab allies, with members of the global south? Certainly we don't have the Russians keen to do this. I mean, is that playing into part of the challenge here?
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. it's going to be increasingly challenging, but the nuance that you spoke of is more important.
You could put a lot of effort into it for not much return, and in fact, probably a counterproductive return.
Paul, thank you. Let me turn back, Sanam, to you as well. We've discussed at length in the report how Iran intends to engage in what we've termed personalized warfare, seizing dual and foreign nationals as hostages, targeting dissidents and U.S. officials in the U.S., Europe, Turkey, Iraq, elsewhere for assassination. The report lays out pretty directly very explicit recommendations on how to address these efforts by the Islamic Republic. Talk to us a bit about, A, why such an effort is required, and as somebody based not in the U.S. but in London, can the U.S. be successful if it takes on these efforts or even a broader policy to Iran alone? Or does it really need to engage and work with the global allies it has in order to procure success?
Sure, Jonathan. I think this is a really important topic. Certainly, addressing Iran's malign behavior doesn't stop at the borders of the Middle East. Iran has been exporting this level of instability and interference across the world and impacting its own citizens and dual nationals, officials abroad, and using this hostage-taking policy in a very dangerous way. I think above all, and this comes through in the report, and as someone who sits in London and works in London and also coordinates a lot with European policymakers, any approach related to Iran, but specifically also on this issue, requires multilateral work with partners and allies abroad. The United States on its own, while certainly muscular and robust, does a better job when it is working with its partners abroad. And here there is a unique and I think essential opportunity to work with the UK, European countries, also partners in the Middle East in order to curtail and push back and restrain this breach of sovereignty to countries in Europe. Activists are seriously under threat right now in many countries in Europe. There's certainly internal disinformation and misinformation campaigns that Iran supports abroad. And the only way to stop this is to work collectively to do so. And certainly another sort of facet or feature of the way Iran engages abroad and part of its strategy is to try to divide and create divisions between Europe, UK, and American policymakers. So a more robust and cohesive Iran strategy shouldn't start and stop in Washington. It should extend beyond the Atlantic Ocean. And I think there's a real opportunity to coordinate with partners abroad that are facing a lot of these serious challenges.
Sanam, thank you very much. Alan, let me give you the last question from me before we turn to a number of questions we're getting online and from our audience. You talk about the report holistically, if you would, because you had perhaps the unenviable responsibility for bringing the effort together into a single, holistic, cohesive document. Over 50 different written contributions, dozens of interviews, countless discussions between the advisory committee and working group. I'm saying discussions, I'm being kind. A number of debates is really what I should say. But ultimately, they're all reflected in it, and of course, some of your own analysis as well, little of mine. Share with the audience what surprised you the most about the various inputs, about where we got to from where you thought we might end up when we started, because we really did this trying to have no direction. We wanted this to happen organically and to end up wherever we ended up. We said everything will be on the table, every option. We're not discounting anything. Talk about developing an executable strategy that the report now is.
Well, my first surprise was that the group didn't agree with everything I was saying. That was a shock. No. No, I think it's already been mentioned that the group had, looking at the working group and the advisory group, had very diverse backgrounds. I think that mix was very rich and really gave us a variety of perspectives that were really crucial, from foreign diplomats to military experts, economists, people who were born in Iran and have studied it their whole lives, people who have been in think tanks or academia, NGOs, intelligence community people as well. So it was really, I think, a very rich mixture of experiences that people brought to it. The second thing was, as has also been mentioned briefly, diversity of viewpoints. We had, I think, folks who wanted to take a very hard line on Iran, others and wanted to emphasize military pressure, others who were much more focused on diplomacy and soft power tools. And again, given that mix, one of my concerns was, how are we going to come to consensus here? Speaking seriously about my surprise, I was a bit surprised at how willing everyone was to search for consensus, to look for a middle ground, if you will, that captured a bit of everybody's perspective. And I think that really contributed to the papers, to the strategy papers' success. I also was really impressed by the fact that, in addition to the group having a really strong commitment to developing a strategy that would support and promote U.S. interest in the region, there was a real passion for helping the Iranian people as well, which I think comes through very strongly in the report. And one thing that I think is a real strength of the report, when I compare it to other think tank assessments that I looked at in kind of trying to kind of frame my own thinking on this, is the combination of strategic perspective, but also very practical, tactical recommendations as well for U.S. policy stances. The strategic being sort of, you've got to deal with their regional behavior, their nuclear program, their abuse of their own people. But tactically, it gets down to issues such as, how do you deal with their hostage diplomacy? How do you respond to their continued effort to engage in assassinations of dissidents abroad? A lot of very concrete, I think, and practical proposals that for addressing the Iranian challenge.
It's always hard when you're in government and you read a report that just says the U.S. should do X, Y, and Z, and you sit there and go, thank you.
And I think
we should.
I do think we got beyond that.
But I think we got beyond that as well. So thank you very much, and are much more specific. Let me go to some of the audience questions, and the first one I want to take is what I would have asked next, frankly. Saad says, looking at the more immediate term, how probable is it for the Israel and Iran situation to escalate into full-scale war? And what would the United States do? Is there a concern that you could see a new Iraq war, frankly, from this? Obviously, we can't predict the future, but Beth, maybe I'll start with you. Where is this going? But talk a little bit, too, about what it may mean for the strategy we laid out as well, and how it may implicate it.
Well, I mean, I think the humility factor that Sanam brought up is really important here, because there's so many variables at play. And anyone who really tells you they know how this is all going to turn out, I would question their sanity. I do think that, we're in a period of, clearly escalation has it's underway. We're already in a regional war, right? The question is whether it continues to expand and engulf more of the region. That's a possibility, but I guess I personally am thinking that there is enough fear on the part of Iran that I don't think that we're going to get to, beyond where we are right now. Maybe a few more steps, but who knows? I don't know. I'm worried, but I don't see an Iraq war. I do think that, for us thinking about the moment that we're in, part of the reason there are a number of variables is because the United States is an actor, right? It's an actor that doesn't have a lot of agency or influence right now over Israel. And that's a really key factor. But we and the French and the UK and others have a lot of influence in different parts of the region. And so right now is actually the moment that the part of the strategy that is trying to break the vice grip of these proxy forces on Lebanon, for example, the influence of Hezbollah in propping up the Syrian regime, just the difficulties that the Iranian controlled proxies in Iraq, and of course the civil war in Yemen. All of these things we've been playing with around the years. We work at those things, but now is the moment we need to double down on them. And I'll stop there because there are other facets that we have to go after regarding Iran.
Absolutely. Let me go to some of the U.S. media who are asking a couple questions. Voice of America said the following, and let me ask Sanam, perhaps you'd be well positioned to answer this because you're in London. Do you agree with Vice President Kamala Harris's assessment in the 60 Minutes interview that the U.S.'s greatest adversary is Iran, and why? How about China? And what are the biggest challenges or failures or problems of the Biden administration's Iran strategy? Why hasn't it worked so far?
That's a big one. I think that there are a hierarchy of challenges for the United States. I'm surprised that Iran has jumped place. I think that Iran is certainly the biggest regional challenge for the United States. I'm not sure if it's the biggest global challenge. So I'll leave that there. Certainly what I think has been missing for the past 4 years, but I would say much longer than that, is that there hasn't been an Iran strategy. There has been sort of a reactive approach.
We may have lost Sanam for a second. Let me ask maybe, Alan, do you want to pick up on this a little bit and where she was coming in terms of the Biden strategy and what it has and has not accomplished vis-a-vis Iran?
My own view is that we need the Biden strategy has perhaps overemphasized diplomacy over use of more kinetic measures of deterrence against Iran. And I would say that we're at a moment right now, though, where there are the weakening of Hezbollah, the weakening of Hamas, and Iran being kind of on its back foot do offer a real opportunity for implementing some of the proposals that we talk about in our strategy report, because one of the key elements that we discuss is how to shore up weak and unstable states in the region as a way to counter Iranian influence. But I think we have to keep in mind the fact that the military actions that Israel is engaged in right now by themselves are not enough to resolve this problem. That we need a much more holistic approach, and I think that's where the U.S. really has to step in and steer this toward a strategic and political end rather than simply a military end. As Dan Vyman said in a recent piece, he asked the question, can Israel kill its way to victory? And I think the answer is no.
Appreciate that. Obviously, the conflict with Israel, Iran is frankly likely to escalate as we await on this very moment today Israel's response to Iran's ballistic missile strike from last week. Paul, let me ask you, there's an interesting question here about U.S. deterrence strategy, and what it asks is, what would be a more effective U.S. deterrence strategy that could result in meaningful pressure on Iran? It brings up the point that Alan was just addressing. Israel has been able to inflict some significant pain on Iranian proxies. The U.S. hasn't really been part of that, though I will acknowledge that the U.S. has played a huge role and a robust role in the defense of Israel. But for deterrence, U.S. deterrence, how do you separate that from Israeli deterrence, Israel's efforts, and what needs to be done?
It's not easy to do to separate them. I think that the approach that should be pursued would revolve around doing what we can to ensure that, particularly as set out in the report, that I think a deterrent strategy that relies on reacting kinetically to each kinetic strike on US forces. I think that would do a lot to rebuild deterrence, and also not strictly deterrence, but related to it. I think again, it's spelt out in the report. It's very important to make sure that the sanctions regime is as tight as possible, and that particular leaks are plugged, because they, of course, enable Iran to take the actions that we want to deter.
There is a lot of discussion in the report about sanctions and about how to more effectively use sanctions. We talk quite explicitly about not only going after those who are benefiting from Iran's illicit oil sales, obviously China, but about going after those who are helping to play a middle role. And we call out some of those. Let me ask this, riffing off of one of the questions, and Sanam, because we're quickly running out of time. I'm glad you're back with us. Maybe I'll conclude with this question with you. There's a lot in the report that tries to address a whole host of issues. We wanted to make it as holistic as possible. But there's a question here about what the long-term vision is for Iran that is not an adversary of the United States. It's a country with an incredibly rich history, culturally advanced nation, as the question points out. How do we move beyond, and can you move beyond the current adversarial relationship between Iran and the US, Iran and Israel, Iran and much of Europe, Iran and much of the world, so long as this regime is still in place?
Given me a very hard question yet again, and sorry for the connectivity issues. Just very quickly, I would just say it's very hard to think long-term about a different Iran. And in fact, I think too often we're trying to wish the Islamic Republic was different or change the Islamic Republic. I'm a realist. I believe we have to deal with what's on hand and try to come to a very pragmatic place where we can diplomatically and through deterrence try and prioritize and change Iran's behavior or constrain Iran's behavior. I think these are the options right now. And only can we think of a longer term vision for a change in Iran or a change relationship with Iran with time, when there is accountability, good governance, hopefully on the Iranian side, but actionable change coming from Iran itself. Obviously, also, there needs to be a commitment from the United States and its partners abroad to maintain a diplomatic track along with deterrence. The inconsistency in approach towards Iran is something Iran has certainly exploited, and Iranian people have paid the price for. But I think it's hard to think about the future right now. I think we should take it one step at a time, build consensus in the United States and with partners, and try to imagine what the priorities are and tackle them collectively, again, transatlantically, but above all, strategically, because without that strategy, the Iran problem set continues to grow as it has done over multiple U.S. administrations.
Sanam, thank you very much. My sincere apologies for the, frankly, multitude of questions that we did not get to. I encourage you to read the report. Hopefully you'll find some answers within it. If not, please reach out to us. Thank you all for joining us for what has frankly been a fascinating first panel with our Iran Strategy Project Advisory Committee members. A reminder to read the full report, you can go to atlanticcouncil.org. We're going to take a short break here in the room, but we encourage you to stay with us. In just about 10 minutes, NBC's Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube is going to sit down with former U.S. National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster for his take on the future of U.S. policy toward Iran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and welcome to the Atlantic Council, where I have the distinct honor and pleasure today of helping the Atlantic Council roll out a fascinating new report. And I have to say, I cannot imagine a more appropriate time for this report than literally today with everything that is going on in the world. And I am very honored to be joined by H.R. McMaster. This is weird. I'm not really sure where to look. You're kind of all around me in the room here.
I apologize for that.
General McMaster retired from the Army as a lieutenant general after 34 years on active duty. During his time in uniform, he commanded troops in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Operation Desert Storm in 1990. He also served as an advisor to senior military commanders all throughout the region during his time in the Army, and ultimately becoming National Security Advisor to then President Donald Trump from 2017 to 2018. He's also the author of numerous books, including his most recent one just out, At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. General McMaster, welcome.
Hey, Courtney, great to be with you. Great to be with the Atlantic Council.
I think we're all jealous that we're not in California with you, but we'll move past that for now. So as I said, we're here to launch this new report from the Atlantic Council. It's 2 years in the making, and it's called The Future of U.S. Strategy Towards Iran, a bipartisan roadmap for the next administration. I have my printed out copy here, but you can find it on their website. I highly recommend it. It's a fascinating read, and then there's also these top lines that you can get that I was actually just going through that is also fascinating. It's a good way of looking at some of the policy recommendations in here. But I want to start with why this report coming out today, October 8th, the timing is just pretty remarkable. It's not just because we're less than a month from a change of administration, but also because of just what's happening in Iran, in the Middle East, and with Israel. And so everyone right now, General McMaster, is talking about how Israel could respond to last week's ballistic missile attack from Iran. But I want to ask you the other side. Do you think the U.S. should get involved in a possible response? And if so, how?
Well, Courtney, thanks a lot. I mean, we already are involved. You know, we're already involved because Iran has been waging a 4-decade-plus long proxy war against us, you know, the great Satan, Israel, who they refer to as the cancerous boil, and their Arab neighbors, as well as I would think I would say the West generally. And I think what's really important to determining whether or not the U.S. should do more to counter this form of aggression of using proxies and terrorist organizations and militias in an effort to push us out of the region as the first step to isolating and destroying Israel and killing all the Jews. That's what they really want to do. And the other aspect of this strategy is to build up these militias and terrorist organizations that are outside of states' control, so they can be turned against that state if that state acts against Iranian interests. This is the Hezbollah model, basically. And it is how they are endeavoring to keep the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict, to extend that hegemonic influence across the region. And again, create the land bridge to the Mediterranean, isolate Israel, build this ring of fire around Israel and destroy the country and kill all the Jews. And, I think when we act like we don't know what the return address is, that's when we get into problems, because all of this talk, Courtney, of like de-escalation and, turning down the temperature, when from the perspective of the supreme leader, he hears that as they have license to escalate on their own terms with impunity. So I think it's an important report at an important time, because it's very clear, that the Biden administration approach and the 8 years of the Obama administration approach to Iran doesn't work. It's not working, because it undervalues the degree to which the ideology of the revolution drives and constrains Iranian leaders, and it doesn't consider, the long record, the 4-decade-plus long proxy war. Hey, Courtney, just since October 8th, just since like 1 year ago today, since that time, there have been nearly 180 attacks on U.S. forces or U.S. facilities in the Middle East through Iranian proxies. We've responded to, I think, 11 of those. And so from the Iranian perspective, hey, they can get away with it, And when we told them to take the Israelis to take the win in April, after hundreds of projectiles were fired at them, I think this kind of feckless approach to Iran has really emboldened Iran and created the illusion that Iran's strong, when I think Iran is actually quite weak.
So two things that you just brought up actually are mentioned in the report. One is that it argues that to counter Iran's military threat, the U.S. has to maintain an adequate military presence in the region and respond with appropriate force to an attack on U.S. and allied partners and interests in the region. So, I mean, you just touched on that. Do you think the U.S. does right now have enough of a footprint in the region? I mean, we just heard the U.S. military is planning to pull, we don't know how many troops out of Iraq over the next year to two. Do you think the U.S. has enough presence in the region, and how would you recommend that the U.S. respond to these attacks, as you mentioned them, by these proxy groups in the area?
Courtney, I don't know really whether it's adequate, because it depends on what you want the force to do, right? If the force is there to convince the Iranians that they can no longer pursue these attacks through proxy forces in a way that disrupts global shipping, places our naval forces at risk, places our soldiers at risk, including those who they killed in Jordan and those who they've wounded elsewhere across the region, then hey, it's not adequate. But I don't know if it's the force level, Courtney, as much as it is the authorities for them to act. Remember how long it took really for the administration to even acknowledge that that Hamas was connected to Iran through the training, the equipping, and I believe helping to plan and orchestrate the mass murder attacks of October 7th. The same thing with Hezbollah and their continued attacks against Israel. You remember firing the missiles on October 8th. How about assembling a proxy army in Syria, about 40,000 strong, on Israel's border, or the massive increase in weapon shipments to the West Bank? I mean, it's clear what Iran is doing, through the Houthis as well. Why is there an IRGC commander in Yemen who's orchestrating these attacks in the Bab el-Mandeb region against shipping? I mean, why is that person still alive? I mean, why is there an Iranian ship anchored off of Djibouti that's collecting on the maritime traffic and helping to organize those Houthi attacks? So I just think that if it's really not the level of force as much as it is for the authorities to respond. I mean, every one of these sort of intercepts, that our military is conducting, and I'll tell you, our soldier sailors, airmen, Marines are doing a fantastic job who are deployed there. But every one of those is like a diving catch, to stop that missile. You've got to be able to destroy the Archer as well. And so I think, according, it's more the authorities than it is kind of the amount of force that we have in the region. But the point that the report makes is really correct. I mean, what we've done over the years, and this is true in the Trump administration as well as in the Biden administration, is we keep talking about our intention to leave the Middle East, right? And to regard the Middle East as just a mess to be avoided. And we need to get out of the Middle East because we have the real competition with China. And of course, that ignores the fact that the Middle East is an arena of competition, not only with Iran, but also with Russia and China. And when we have demonstrated our unwillingness to retaliate to even egregious acts of aggression against us, we gave up our military leverage on Iran. And then when the Biden administration stopped enforcing the sanctions against Iran, which resulted in, we think, about $100 billion of cash flowing into their coffers that they used to increase their stipend and resources available for their terrorist and militia groups across the region, and plus the direct payments we're making. Remember there was $6 billion we're sitting in a Qatar's bank on October 6th of last year, getting ready to transfer that for those frozen assets back to Iran. I mean, it's astounding to me the degree to which we had continued to try to conciliate the Iranians, even as they were intensifying their attacks against us, their Arab neighbors, and certainly against Israel. So I think act like we know what the return address is. Recognize that a conciliatory approach to Iran not only isn't working, but hasn't worked at all in its two permutations under the Obama administration and under the Biden administration. And it's just time for a fundamental shift in our approach. And that's why I'm glad this report has come out when it has.
So when you talk about the return address, I mean, are you suggesting that you think that the U.S. should take strikes inside Iran as a deterrent or as a way of actually crippling some of their capabilities?
Well, I think we should do first things first, right? So Israel has really is on its way to destroying Hamas and has really had a devastating effect on Hezbollah. Iran would want to have to commit significant resources, right, to try to rebuild those organizations, as well as to strengthen, the proxy army in Syria and so forth. That takes money, I would go after cash flow first. And then also, the Houthis aren't manufacturing these shorter-ship missiles in Yemen, I mean, why aren't we physically interdicting, those resupply lines, for example? That's an easy one. How about just enforcing the sanctions that are already on the books? How about, maybe imposing some more sanctions, getting others to join us in those sanctions? But then also, I do, as you're alluding to, there have to be military options available as well. And the key would be, what would those objectives be? I think the objectives would be twofold. First, to restore deterrence against the Iranians, such that they no longer, conduct their attacks through proxies against us. But the second would be to diminish their capacity to do damage. So after they fired now hundreds of missiles against Israel, lots of rockets and missiles against our forces, they're providing Shahed drones and missiles to Russia so they can continue to murder Ukrainians. I mean, why should there be Shahed drone factories and missile factories left in Iran? We also often lament the asymmetrical capabilities of our adversaries and enemies. Well, hey, we have some asymmetrical capabilities too, and maybe we should introduce the Iranians to them. Also, we recognize that an Iran that has the most destructive weapons on earth is not acceptable, certainly to the Israelis who know that the supreme leaders called them the cancerous boils, threatened to wipe them off the face of the earth. Israel's already under continuous assault by Iranian proxies. How can they allow them to have the most destructive weapons on earth? So when do the missile facilities, but as well as the nuclear facilities, when are those options brought to the president? Courtney, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is, what the situation looked like vis-a-vis North Korea in 1994. If we went back to that moment today, maybe the military option would receive a higher degree of consideration, given what's happened since then. So, and then of course, diplomatic action is very important in this connection. I think tracing the grievances of the Palestinian people, of the Lebanese people back to the Iranians is really important. Think of the billions of dollars that were diverted away from the Palestinian people in Gaza and into Hamas's terrorist infrastructure. Think about how Nasrallah has said, the weakness of the Israelis is that they love life. We can take that from them. Then he would say, we love death, and that's our strength. Well, what he means, we love death. He didn't really love death, Nasrallah, but he was willing to sacrifice any number of his fellow Lebanese, to pursue the objective of destroying Israel. The same thing with Hamas, and the degree to which they knew the civilian population of Gaza would be put at risk, and they continue to use them, as Hezbollah does, as human shields and so forth. So how about, the sovereignty of Iraq? Iran is working to keep Iraq perpetually weak. We're on the side of strong Arab nations. Iran is on the side of perpetual weakness. Hey, and also, Courtney, half the Syrian population is dead, wounded, or displaced, thanks in large measure to Iran's proxy army there and the actions of the RGC. Where have the college campus protests been about that? Why is that? Why do we only engage in self-flagellation instead of calling out, the brutality and the violence and the suffering that they have inflicted on so many? And look at Yemen. I mean, of course, we're talking about the disruption of maritime trade, but the Houthis are starving people to death in Yemen. So from a humanitarian perspective, from a geostrategic perspective, we have to be a lot tougher on Iran, and this is not just beating war drums, it's responding to literally hundreds of acts of war against the United States, Israel, and Iran's Arab neighbors.
But I want to ask about sort of the day after in that scenario, because this is something that we've been hearing a lot about lately, is this notion of escalating to de-escalate, or restoring deterrence through an act of escalation. And one thing that we've seen, I mean, frankly, especially since April, is this back and forth between Israel and Iran. It just seems to go back and forth until one side stops. And the concern being that there will be a point where it actually escalates to the point where neither side can stop, and it really, explodes. But I wonder if in this scenario of a strike against something like a manufacturing facility in Iran where they make their drones, or where they make component parts maybe for advanced missiles that they provide the Houthis, or whatever it is, the notion of a strike against that, what does the day after look like in that scenario? Do you think there's any way that Iran wouldn't respond to something like that? And with that response, I mean, how could they possibly respond, especially if it was a U.S. strike, or if it was a coalition involving the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, I think you're pointing out something that's very important when you're considering any kind of military option is what happens next, right? And war, these acts of war really start an interaction between, I guess, in this case, as you're suggesting, the U.S. and allied and strategic partners in the region and Iran. And so you're asking exactly the right question. What does Iran do next? I think, but also you have to place it in the context of what is the objective, right? The objective can't be like an emotional cathartic, right? Like, I feel better now because we struck Iran. It should be to impose costs on Iran that go far beyond anything that they've factored in as they continue to use proxies and in the strategy of their willingness to expend every Arab life in pursuit of their aims of pushing us out of the region and isolating and destroying Israel. And again, that would be with the objective of deterring Iran from further acts of hostility, aggression, and violence against us and our Arab partners and our Israeli ally. But I think more concrete military objectives are oftentimes better, which would be to dramatically decrease the resources that Iran has available to wage its proxy wars. And when you begin to think about that, you begin to think of the IRGC's capabilities, its communications capabilities, its headquarters capability, but as well as the factories that are manufacturing these instruments of death in the form of Shahed drones and missiles and rockets. And then you also may have an objective, this would be a separate one, of seriously degrading and setting back their nuclear and missile programs broadly, right? So that's what would drive the military action, or what are the objectives. But the overall political objective, I think, is what you're alluding to. So when does it ever get better, right? Well, as long as you have the revolutionaries in charge in Iran, you're going to have the continuing suffering of the Iranian people, as well as the pursuit of this, the strategy of what they call, forward defense, which is really forward offense against their Arab neighbors and against Israel and against the U.S. and the region. And so I think what we ought to also be doing is engaging in a range of activity to try to strengthen groups that are in opposition to the Iranians and to the revolutionaries that were in charge there. And a lot of this has an informational dimension to it. Trace the grievances of the Iranian people back to those who are causing it, which is an Iranian government, a theocratic dictatorship, and Ayatollah Khamenei and those who is put into the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, prioritizing these proxy wars and prioritizing, the death and suffering that they've caused in the region over the welfare of the Iranian people. There have been some encouraging developments in recent protests. These were in response to Mahsa Amini's death, but also other protests in which Iranians were chanting, "Hey, the problem is not America. The problem is right here," right? And so I think there can be a lot more done from an informational dimension and diplomatic dimension as well. But I think overall, what the world should hope for is a fundamental change in the nature of the Iranian government. Now, we're not going to do that, right? We're not going to do a regime change in Iran. but that's up to the Iranian people. But we need a government in Iran, and the Iranian people need a government in Iran that ceases its permanent hostility to the United States, its Arab neighbors, and Israel, and the West broadly.
That's actually something the report talks about as well, is sort of the importance of allies in the region and how that can change some of the calculus. And I wonder, the events, let's say, of the last year in the region, how have they reshaped relations with historic U.S. allies in the region?
Well, I think there's been a reassessment, right? So what happened is, because of, I think, the Obama administration's 8 years of essentially self-defeating policy in the Middle East by defining really their whole Middle East policy, their whole Iran policy for sure, around the flawed Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which was flawed, from a technical perspective in terms of, a weak verification regime and the sunset clauses and not including missiles, but also, was flawed because it didn't connect that agreement to the other part of the problem with Iran, which is their sustained proxy wars against us. And so the sanctions relief that they got and the big direct payoffs, I mean, literally flying, planes full of cash, to Tehran, really allowed Iran to intensify those proxy wars. So, but that approach was trying to resurrect it in the Biden administration, and of course that alienated a lot of our allies and set back, I think, some of the relationships with Gulf states that we saw that the tremendous progress during the Abraham Accords, the normalization of relations among some Gulf states and other states with Israel, and I think what it did also, because of this perception of our disengagement from the region, is it allowed Russia to continue this role of a dual role of arsonist and fireman in the region, with this kind of bait and switch that it was trying, with trying to get normalization of relations with Syria and Assad, and telling people, hey, over time, if you help underwrite the reconstruction of the country we just rubbled, we'll work over time to diminish Iranian influence. And of course, Israel, was duped by that to a certain extent, and so are some of the Gulf states with this normalization of relations. Of course, now Israel has no more illusions about this, and I don't think either do the Gulf states. So, also because we had disengaged, or we're saying we're going to disengage from the region, we demonstrated an unwillingness to act like we know what the return address was in Iran. So we gave up any kind of military leverage over Iran. Then we didn't enforce the sanctions. So you know what? We gave up economic leverage over Iran. So the Gulf states are looking around like, who's got our back? America doesn't have our back. They don't have leverage anymore. And this is why in this normalization of relations agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Saudis really, the Iraqis and the Omanis who brokered that deal asked China to come in over top of it. Because guess what? After we gave up our leverage, China still has leverage over Iran. So I just think this mantra of disengagement from the Middle East and this tendency to see the Middle East as mainly just a mess to be avoided is self-defeating. And we've diminished our influence now, but I think it's coming back. Thank you, Ayatollah Khamenei. We should send him maybe some flowers and a box of chocolates. If we come to our senses now and recognize the nature of the threat, recognize the danger of continuing to try to placate the regime, and then also recognize the kind of profound weakness of that regime and start treating it as such.
So wait, explain to me what you just said. You think that what has been restored in the region is a U.S.
A recognition that the United States is the indispensable partner, right? That that what we have seen together too, Courtney, and this is really the broader geostrategic context, is a coalescing of what I would call an axis of aggressors, including two revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia, but also, the strategic partnership that Russia and China have entered into with Iran, as well as bringing in North Korea, and this coalescing of this axis of aggressors and the very material support that they're providing one another, right? The Shahed drones and the missiles that Iran is providing to Russia. Russia is in turn providing technical assistance, we know, for their missile program, probably for the nuclear program as well. China is helping Iran by purchasing more and more of its oil, and so I just think that what we have to recognize, and what I think what our partners in the region now recognize is, hey, the United States actually wants countries in the region to be strong, right? It is Iran, aided and abetted by Russia and China principally, that wants to keep them perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict. Look at the dilemma that the Iraqis have. They have these Iranian militias that are stronger than, or as strong at least as the Iraqi armed forces. So that is undermining the sovereignty, of Iraq. Look at what's happening in Yemen and the continued tragedy there with the Iranian support of the Houthis. Again, the Syrian civil war. I mean, one of the beautiful countries, some of the most beautiful cities in the Middle East are in rubble. Look what they did, and the Iranians helped the Assad regime do in Aleppo with the aiding and abetting of the Russians, right? So, the list goes on. Look at Lebanon, right? In a country with amazing potential, beautiful country on the Mediterranean. Gaza. I mean, hey, President Trump used to say to me all the time, and he got this right. He would say, hey, everywhere there's a problem in the Middle East, I look and there's Iran, and that's true. And I think that we ought to start behaving, accordingly, like we recognize that.
I want to remind the audience, you can ask questions, by the way, they'll pop up on this iPad. I'm severely technically challenged, I fully admit that, but they assure me they will arrive here. And you can go to askac.org to ask your questions. We have about 15 more minutes, and then we are going to take some audience questions. I want to go back to something else that was in the report that I was really struck by, because when we talk about Iran, I feel like the priority or the main thing that's spoken about from a threat level is always their potential nuclear program. But the report actually places a priority on the importance of something that you were talking about earlier, General, and that's the Iranian proxy or militia groups in the region. And the report even says that issue needs the same attention and prioritization of the nuclear issue. I know at the Pentagon, there are U.S. military officials who I speak with who say their ballistic missile program also needs to be in that same category, and maybe even more of a concern than their nuclear program. And I guess I want to ask you, in this, what we're watching happen right now, with some of these proxy groups really being damaged, command and control being taken out, their stockpiles being taken out, do you see this as a continuing model for Iran to meddle, for lack of a better word, in the region, using these proxy groups? And I wonder if, similarly to how terror networks continue to seem to always pop up in areas, is it possible that they eliminate some of these groups, the military arms these groups, and they just form other proxy groups and the underlying issues continue?
Well, Courtney, that's certainly what the Iranians will endeavor to do, but it's really important to look at the track record during the Trump administration, when there was a concerted effort, by a number of key people to dry up the resources available to the RGC. The RGC cut their stipend for Hezbollah, Hamas, and PIJ in half. Right? They were talking about like a reduction in forces, in the proxy army in Syria. So I think I think there can be a lot that can be done from a financial perspective, and restricting the resources that are available, constraining the resources available to the Iranians. But also, I think we have to impose costs directly on Iran to deter their continued support for them. One of the things about this mantra of, de-escalation, which reminds me of, it sounds like I'm back in like 1964 and 65 in the Lyndon Johnson administration, with graduated pressure and Operation Rolling Thunder and so forth. But, I think that it really puts us in a perpetual state of only playing defense, right? And only playing defense doesn't work in any sport, and it doesn't work obviously in war or in this competition with Iran. So I think we need to play offense, and that doesn't necessarily mean military strikes. Certainly not military strikes alone, but we need to be offensive from a financial perspective, a diplomatic perspective, an informational perspective, a law enforcement perspective. Hezbollah is a mafia organization. It's one of the largest drug trafficking organizations in the world. And so identifying and interrupting the financial flows associated with that, they're also one of the largest human trafficking organizations in the world. So I just think, an overall integrated approach with the objective of isolating the Iranian regime from sources of strength and support, as well as imposing costs on that regime that go far beyond, anything that is anything that they've factored in at the outset of their decision. And then also, we do need to block their path to the most destructive weapons on Earth and the delivery mechanisms for those most destructive weapons. And of course, that would require some hard work, across all of the departments of our government under the auspices of the NSC to provide the president with options and decision points associated with when he or she would have to make a decision about the use of force. And of course, there's always risk of action, always, and you have to consider that risk and be upfront about it. But I think what we've learned from the unenforced red line in Syria and other acts of disengagement or inaction, that there's a huge risk to inaction as well. And I think those have to be highlighted for the president as well.
What is your biggest concern with this current situation right now? Because there seems to be a very clear escalation ladder that's continuing, and the U.S. is, as you mentioned, a part of it, right?
Yeah.
What is your biggest concern about the current situation and the U.S. involvement in it?
Well, I mean, my biggest concern is again this mantra of de-escalation. I mean, why aren't we telling the Iranians to de-escalate? I mean, why would we tell Israel to de-escalate? I think that what you've seen with the actions against Hezbollah, with the beepers and the walkie-talkies, and then the physical strikes against the leadership, I think that's exposed kind of the folly of this narrative of de-escalation. I think Israel, prior to the actions against Hezbollah, was in maybe, I think, the most precarious position Israel's been in since 1948. And they demonstrated that they were going to act rather than remain in a sort of besieged state, right? The lesson, as we talk about a year after the heinous attacks of October 7th, from Israeli perspective, is, hey, you can't have a terrorist organization on your border with those kind of capabilities. And of course, they have the pressing need to get 70,000 or so of their displaced citizens back into the northern part of the country, the 10% of their territory they've had to evacuate. So I think what I'm concerned about is, this mantra of de-escalation. Hey, tell the Iranians to de-escalate. And then also just kind of the logical disconnect, Courtney, between saying, hey, there needs to be a ceasefire, but then also saying we need to get on the path to an enduring peace, between Israel and its neighbors, and Israel and the Palestinians, and the mention of a two-state solution. If Hamas still has the guns in Gaza, that means there can be no progress toward a two-state solution, because this is an organization who, in its charter, is determined to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. Hey, that doesn't sound like they're signing up for a two-state solution to me. Same thing for Hezbollah or PIJ or any of these other groups. So I think we ought to begin to regard the destruction of these organizations and the fostering of an alternative security order, maybe a multinational one initially, and then a Palestinian one, for example, in Gaza, but they can bridge into a political order that is not dominated or controlled by an organization that is determined to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. And that's a precondition, in my view, to a better life for the Palestinians and to any kind of progress that we might be able to envision toward an enduring peace.
There's a question from someone online, Tom Warwick, who actually has the same question that I have, so I'm going to read it. General McMaster, do you agree with Vice President Harris's statement on 60 Minutes calling Iran the greatest adversary to the U.S. right now?
Well, it depends on how you define great. Maybe the most brazen, I would say. Certainly. And and maybe imminent. But of course we have again this axis of aggressors to consider. And I think when we act like they're not connected to one another, we actually help them cover for one another and obfuscate. For example, I mean, think about how ridiculous it was for us to implore that the Chinese, make the case to the Iranians to rein in the Houthis. I mean, really, do we think that's going to happen? So I just think that when we try to divide Russia and China and ask China to do us a solid, with Russia on something, I think we perpetuate this kind of myth that they're not operating in concert with one another. That China's not, for example, continuing to feed Putin's ATM with the cash he needs to sustain the war, and especially the hardware and equipment that he needs to sustain his war manufacturing machine. So I just think we have to stop this delusion that we can divide them and separate them and recognize the connections between them, and to look for opportunities associated with those connections, to physically and financially and economically weaken the links between them. But also in the case, for example, of the continued onslaught of Ukraine, I mean, we should hang that as a lodestone, not only around the neck of Vladimir Putin, but we should tape him together with Xi Jinping, not only because they've already professed their enduring partnership, but because they deserve each other, but because I think that's what's much more effective, from the perspective of this most important, I think, geostrategic competition.
I do want to. There's one other thing that really stood out to me in the report, and I should have said, if I didn't already, that this report is bipartisan, which is a rare thing in Washington D.C. these days. So I do think it warrants mention. But one thing that it recommended was that the potential for some sort of a bipartisan Iran committee, something that's sort of akin to the Select Committee on China. And I wonder what you think of that as a possibility, because another thing in the top lines that I was also struck by, it says that it blames the wild swings, I'm quoting, wild swings in U.S. policy towards Iran over the last decade that have led to some of Iran's advances in their malign influence in the region and everything. So I wonder if you think that if there was some sort of a committee like that on the Hill, bipartisan in nature, if that could potentially address that and maybe bring what are really wide policy differences on this issue together in some way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's a great idea, because I think, through hearings, you could see the folly of, I mean, I don't know how else to put it, but the supplication toward the Iranians that you saw as the Biden administration came back in and tried to resurrect, the failed approach toward Iran of the Obama years, and I think, that shouldn't be a partisan issue. I don't know why, there's this tendency still to kind of define the policy of a new administration mainly as an opposition to the previous administration. There should be really strong elements of continuity, in the area of foreign policy, as we've seen, really with China policy between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And of course, the China Select Committee was stood up kind of after that transition in administrations. But I think the great work that committee's done and the report, with all of those really concrete recommendations, hey, that's an agenda for the executive and legislative branch to work together, with allies and partners internationally. Yeah, I would be all for that, Courtney, and I think it's one of the many strong recommendations in the report.
There's a question here from Anonymous that quotes your book, At War with Ourselves. It says, you often showcase the policy of peace through strength. J.D. Vance referred to it in the vice presidential debate. Do you think this policy is supported by the Democratic Party potential Kamala Harris administration, and has it crystallized across the political spectrum?
Yeah, I don't think so. And so I think that, of course, peace through strength is based on the premise that, hey, it's a heck of a lot cheaper, to prepare for a war or to be ready for a war than to have to fight one, right? And what I've seen is a lack of a sense of urgency to regenerate kind of the hard power that we need in terms of addressing a bow wave of deferred military modernization and real capacity issues across all of the military services and in the joint force broadly. We have been, on this holiday from history for way too long. We're spending kind of historic lows from the post-World War II period on defense in terms of percentage of our GDP invested in defense. And I think it's quite clear in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine that we have allowed our defense industrial base to atrophy to a very dangerous level. And we no longer have the capacity to manufacture weapons and munitions on the scale necessary. We have also been complacent, and this bridges from the hard power, military, which I think we should be spending 5% of GDP on defense, because we're in a race right now. I mean, we're in a race, I think, to deter these conflicts that have already cascaded from Europe into the Middle East, from cascading further into the Indo-Pacific region. But we also have a real economic dimension to national security that we have not addressed with an adequate sense of urgency. And this is really the degree to which we have given China coercive power over our economy because of our over-reliance on single points of failure controlled by China in critical supply chains. And this is, batteries, magnets for that matter, but also all the upstream minerals and components and critical materials that are necessary for our economy broadly, but for our defense industrial base. And so not enough people have paid attention, I think, to this recent development in China, in which they're requiring kind of waivers to export critical minerals and materials to the United States. I think China's about to take action to try to crater our economy and damage our defense industrial base. I think that they may do that, between maybe the election and inauguration, and so we're not acting quickly enough to deregulate, for permitting reform, for economic actions, trade enforcement measures to create the space, right, for the reinvigoration of our industrial base and an effort to make these supply chains more resilient. There's action in all these areas, Courtney, and I want to give credit to the Biden administration, to the Trump administration for initiating this, but we're not doing it with enough sense of urgency, So I think that's what we're missing, is a sense of urgency in development of hard power and in reducing the coercive power that China in particular has over our economy and over our defense industrial base and supply chains associated with it.
I want to ask you one more, because we talked about allies in the region, but we haven't really addressed the U.S. relationship with Israel as an ally. It was another thing that Vice President Harris was asked about on 60 Minutes the other night. Where do you see the relationship with Israel right now? And I should say, only moments before this started, the Israeli defense minister, who was supposed to come to the Pentagon and meet with Lloyd Austin tomorrow, canceled the meeting apparently it was at the advice or the request of the prime minister. Where do you see that relationship right now? Government to government, not people to people.
Right. Well, like you, I only have a partial view of this, but from what I can see from the outside, I think it's tension, associated with, this kind of irreconcilable difference we have, whereas we see the benefits in a ceasefire, and Israel thinks a ceasefire is unacceptable until they complete the defeat of Hamas, where Hamas is no longer viable in Gaza, and there can emerge, some kind of an alternative to Hamas, and a defeat of Hezbollah, such that Hezbollah can no longer threaten the northern part of Israel, such that their citizens can't live there, right? So, and of course, the need to convince Iran, that Iran can't get away, with now this second massive attack from Iranian soil against Israel. I mean, Israel, if you're thinking about it, it's kind of a seven-front war, right? They're fighting, in southern Lebanon and against Hezbollah and Lebanon broadly. They're fighting against, the Iranian proxy army that is in Syria across the Golan. They have the West Bank. They have Gaza. They have the Houthis and the Hashtag-Shabi militias in Iraq, and they've got Iran, and so I think our public messaging about like ceasefire and de-escalation, I think the Israelis are saying, what are you talking about? How can that be acceptable to us? And so anyway, I think that's the main source of tension. And hopefully, this report, and the reality of the situation will help the administration conduct a fundamental reassessment of their approach toward Iran and a recognition, hey, this is one thing, Courtney, I don't get this at all. When you hear about, hey, we really need a diplomatic solution, and so we need a ceasefire. When in history has there ever been a diplomatic outcome to a war that is favorable, but and not based on the military reality, right? There's no such thing. We heard the mantra to justify the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Remember, hey, there's no military solution in Afghanistan. Heck, well, the Taliban came up with one, So I just think that we delude ourselves into thinking that we can have a diplomatic settlement. In this case, it's acceptable to Israel and to the United States and really the Arab nations in the Middle East without first defeating Iran's proxies, convincing them that they've been defeated, convincing Iran that Iran's been defeated. And I would say the same thing to the Biden administration and to a possible Trump or Harris administration. The same thing applies to Ukraine as well. And this idea that you can come up with some kind of a nifty political settlement that doesn't reflect military realities or realities on the ground. I mean, I don't know how that happens. I don't even know when that's ever happened in history.
General McMaster, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure that you will welcome us all out in California sometime soon.
It's pretty nice. Try not to go soft out here. Try not to go soft out here.
Thank you again.
Take care.
And thank you to everyone at the Atlantic Council.
Thanks for the awesome report, Atlantic Council. Thank you. Take care, everybody.